What's up guys, Lifting here. This is a build guide for my tanky Kinetic Blast Elemental Wander that I've been playing this last week. The build is viable for hardcore gameplay and has excellent clear speed in even the highest level of maps. In this video I'll show you the recommended skill gem setup, how to progress through the skill tree, a few unique recommendations and what stats to look for on your gear to make the build as powerful as possible. And it should be said that I do not recommend this build to beginners as it requires the Blood Dance boots and it can be somewhat challenging to level. However, it is one of the fastest clearing builds that I've ever played, so if you can manage to level it up and you can afford those Blood Dance boots, then definitely give it a go. The build has lots of life, tons of evasion and makes use of the Acrobatics Keystone to add that extra layer of defense. And with the skills such as Kinetic Blast, there are multiple ways of scaling the damage. However, this particular build focuses primarily on scaling it via elemental damage, as it is much cheaper to gear and get going compared to a physical based wander. And as I said before, the build requires the Blood Dance boots to function properly, and I would also greatly recommend at least getting yourself a 5-link chest piece and of course a high elemental damage wand. Fortunately, a 5-link chest and one of those wands can be acquired fairly cheaply. So let's talk skill gems. Your primary attack consists of Kinetic Blast, Blood Magic, greater multiple projectiles, faster attacks, weapon elemental damage, and if you get a 6-link, add in slower projectiles. The main weakness of a Kinetic Blast build is its single target damage. To help combat this, I recommend the following setup: Barrage, Cast on Critical Strike, Frost Wall, and Blood Magic. This setup will make it so that every time you crit you have a chance of spawning Frost Walls near the target you attack. This makes it so that the projectiles of your main attack, Kinetic Blast, will bounce off these walls and explode close to the monster, dealing much more damage in a controlled area. And it takes a little getting used to, and it isn't until late game that this setup really starts to shine. However, it is a great way of making sure Kinetic Blast can deal with single target enemies. If you prefer, you can of course use another method, and before you get a good amount of crit, you can simply self-cast the Frost Wall if you prefer. Now, to deal extra damage and generate power charges, you will need Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice, Curse on Hit, and Assassin's Mark. To improve your defenses, I also suggest Cast when Damage Taken level 9, Molten Shell level 14, Ice Golem level 11, and then Grace, which of course doesn't need to be linked to the other gems. Now, it needs to be said here that if you simply want more damage, then you can, instead of using the Grace Aura, use the Wrath Aura, as it significantly increases your elemental damage. But it is up to you to decide. For hardcore players, I would recommend Grace, but Wrath does add a ton of damage. To improve your movement abilities, I also recommend Lightning Warp, faster casting, and Blood Magic in your wand. And then finally, for a great damage increase, I also recommend 3-link 2-wall haste gems and an increased duration support gem in your shield. So now let's talk about how you should level this character, and since wanders in general can be somewhat slow to level and get going, I'm going to give you a few recommendations as to how you can make it more smooth. First of all, I recommend using a Knight's Hold Talisman at level 10 when you are able to use it. It needs to have a red socket and then use it together with a Flame Totem skill gem for the first 30 levels. And if you need strength to level up the Flame Totem, then simply buy an Amber Amulet of Nessa in Act 1. When you reach level 30, I suggest getting yourself a Twistle unique wand. This wand will take you all the way from level 30 until you need to start mapping, and it is fairly cheap. Lastly, make sure to obtain all the necessary skill gems for the build and start leveling as soon as you can by having them equipped on your character. And so let's take a look at the skill tree. For this build's defenses, we're interested in nodes that grants us extra life and evasion. For damage, we want increased attack speed, critical strike chains, critical strike multiplier, wand damage, and elemental damage. And lastly, for general utility, we of course want a few jewel sockets. And with that said, keep in mind that if you already have some powerful jewels for the build, then feel free to socket them in at any time you see fit. So here's how I suggest you go about it. We start here as the Ranger, and the first 25 points will primarily be spent on grabbing some life nodes, and then a bit of extra damage through Ballistic Mastery and Cold-Hearted Calculation. For the next 25 points we will be focusing on moving towards the Witch part of the skill tree, but before we do that, make sure to grab the Strength node and then Piercing Shots. Piercing shots greatly improve the damage of your Kinetic Blast by allowing you to hit more targets and thereby also triggering more explosions. From here we move into the Witch starting area and pick up Wand Slinger, then some more life, and finally Tempest Blast for a nice damage increase with our wands. The next 20 points will be spent on picking up extra Frenzy charges, Acrobatics, some more life, and our very first crit nodes for the build via Assassination and Trickery. We are also picking up more life and attack speed by going into Coordination. The next 19 points is what's going to turn this build into a crit build. We do that by picking up Fusillade up here together with the crit wand skill nodes. Then Heartseeker down by the Ranger starting area, Herbalism for some more life, and then both of the power charges near the Witch and the Shadow. And finally, some more life to improve survivability. And remember, in order to scale the crit nodes, you need a wand with high implicit crit chains, but I will show you an example of this in just a bit. For the final 16 points, we'll be improving our damage by picking up some more crit multi, unlocking the various jewel sockets by the Witch, Shadow, and Ranger, then picking up the remaining life, and then finally the last jewel socket. Again, if you already had good jewels to begin with, then you can spec into these jewel sockets before this point in time, it's up to you. And this is the complete skill tree. Now let's talk about the gear you need for this build. As I mentioned earlier, there's only one required unique for this build, and that is the Blooddanes boots. These boots will allow you to generate frenzy charges without having to run Blood Rage or Poacher's Mark. You can of course just not use frenzy charges if you don't want the boots, but they are a great contributor to your damage and I wouldn't recommend going without them. Again, these are the only required uniques. However, if you want to improve your build even further with additional uniques, I also recommend adding in Rat's Nest. This helmet will give you a much higher crit chance, increased attack speed, increased movement speed, and a nice boost to your evasion rating. If you can afford it, then I highly recommend getting this item. And if you can manage to balance your resistances around it, then Maligaro's Virtuosity is a great choice as well. Because of the increased critical strike chains and critical strike multiplier, these gloves provide you with a significant increase to your damage. If you decide to use all three uniques, it may be tough to get enough life and resistances, so I would recommend simply sticking to the Blooddanes boots and then whichever you prefer or can afford. Again, neither the Rat's Nest nor the gloves are required, just the boots. The most important rare item for your build is your wand. It is through this weapon you scale your damage, and since this is a build that primarily focuses on elemental damage, I recommend getting a wand with flat added fire, lightning and cold damage. It then needs a high critical strike chance, 10 or more is preferred, and then finally increased attack speed. Having a bit of physical damage on the wand is completely fine, as well as that will scale it effectively through the skill tree as well. As for your rare items, you need to look for evasion based items with added life, elemental resistances and increased evasion. To scale your damage, I also recommend looking out for increased attack speed, critical strike chains, critical strike multiplier and increased weapon elemental damage and flat added elemental damage on your rare gear. And if necessary, try to get some strength on your gear as well, as it will help you level up those skill gems. As for your jewels, I recommend looking for a mix of the following affixes: increased critical strike multiplier, increased critical strike chains, attack speed with wands, increased attack speed while holding a shield, and of course increased maximum life. If necessary, you can also get some increased resistances on your jewels. And for this build you should also get 2 Divine Life Flasks of Staunching, 1 Ample Jade Flask of Reflexes, a Ruby, Topaz or Sapphire Flask depending on the content you're farming, and an Ample Quicksilver Flask of Warding to increase your movement speed and protect you against curses. And that's it guys. Remember, if you have any questions, then the best way to contact me is to join me at my Twitch live stream. The link is below. Otherwise, feel free to ask your questions below in the comments or by going to my forum post on the Path of Exile forums. I will do my best to answer any questions that haven't already been answered in this video. If you're interested in more Path of Exile build guides, remember to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?